Zoners will run the metagame in Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl. No, the game is not out yet. No, I do not have a secret pre-release copy. This is all speculation, based on what we've seen of Nickelodeon's gameplay mechanics, and relating those to previous platform fighters that we've studied more, like Melee and Rivals. I could be totally wrong about this, the game comes out in a few days and we'll see, but this is my current best guess. And in this video, I will explain my argument. First, we need to talk about some general fighting game concepts. Commitment, positional advantage, center stage control. Second, we'll talk about changes to Nickelodeon's movement mechanics that I believe affects those dynamics. Finally, we'll talk about how all of this relates to zoning. I'm sure that many of you who have made it this far are already skeptical because of the projectile counterplay mechanics and rushdown mechanics that we've seen in the game so far. Don't worry, we'll get to that. But let's start by talking about the role of positional advantage in fighting games. Many fighting games, perhaps fighting games overall, have developed a reputation for favoring the player who strikes second. The player who attacks first can leave themselves vulnerable if they miss. So if their opponent is mixing up their movement options well, attacking first can be a guess with bad risk reward. But what if neither player wants to commit hard? Well, that's where position comes into play. Your ability to avoid committing is only as good as the mix-ups you have available to you. Some positions will restrict those mix-ups. For example, if you're cornered, you have fewer escape options, fewer ways to retreat. Other positions will enable more mix-ups. If you have center stage, you have more room to move and more positions to threaten from. So when two players want to avoid committing, the player who can finesse a better position is more likely to win out, either by pressuring their opponent to commit first or by rendering their non-committal options more predictable. Now, traditionally, center stage is the primary form of positional advantage universally granted to every character in a fighting game roster. Some characters can capture stage control better than others, but it's a concept most well-designed characters can play for to restrict non-committal play. Which brings us to our next section on movement. I argue that Nickelodeon's changes to movement mechanics make center stage a weaker form of universal positional advantage. See, typically, if you have center stage and your opponent is cornered, you have weakened their ability to play footsies and are pressuring them to commit to a jump. In Nickelodeon, though, I think footsies-based gameplay will be generally weaker, and jumping will be generally stronger and less committal. So let's break that down piece by piece. Based on the gameplay footage I've seen, it looks like initial dash acceleration is pretty slow. It's baked into their dash attack system. You need to build up speed on the ground to use your dash attacks. So dashes start off pretty slow, which is gonna hurt grounded microspacing. The other thing that hurts grounded microspacing is the digital input system. For those of you who don't know, Nickelodeon doesn't read your analog stick the way Smash does. All it reads is left, right, up, down, and diagonals, which means that the number of angles you can wave dash at is restricted, and you won't be able to do very slight wave dashes to microspace. Overall, I think this weakens the footsies-based neutral game that we've come to associate with games like Melee and Slap City. On the other hand, jumping looks like a very fast option. This game has no jump squat, which means as soon as you hit the jump button, you zoop up into the air. You don't have to wait a few extra frames. And from the footage we've seen so far, it seems that most characters have high initial vertical velocity. So this makes jumping pretty fast, but I also think it's going to be pretty non-committal because of the new air dash system. Air dashes, particularly downward air dashes, give you a ton of mix-ups once you jump. In Melee, Rivals, and Slap City, you can fast fall once you've begun falling, and this gives you a little bit of mix-up potential in terms of how you land. But in this game, downward air dashes seem even faster than fast falling, and beyond that, you can use them before you even reach the height of your jump. You can start a downward air dash from anywhere during your full hop, rising up or falling back down, and this gives you a ton of mix-ups in terms of how you land. You can land at different timings, you can land either in front of you or behind you, you can land with a hitbox or without a hitbox. There are a lot of different options. And so I think these triangle jumps, these full hops into downward air dashes, are going to be the core of safe, non-committal gameplay in Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl. And I think center stage control will be a less effective way of restricting these vertical-oriented footsies compared to how they've restricted horizontally-oriented footsies in the past. So what does all of this have to do with zoners? Well, zoners are characters that provide their own form of positional advantage. When a zoner places a slow-moving projectile that leaves themselves actionable, they've created a way to pressure-safe mix-ups. That makes zoners the archetype least reliant on center stage control as a universal positional advantage tool. Not to mention, you could imagine that certain aerial projectiles could hamper triangle jumps specifically. So that's my core argument. I think the movement mechanics enable jumping, they weaken ground-based gameplay, and this makes center stage a weaker form of positional advantage, giving zoners a lot of room to shine in terms of how they supply their own positional advantage. Now, I mentioned near the start of the video that Nickelodeon offers some mechanics for both dealing with projectiles and enabling rushdown based gameplay, so I want to cover those real quick. So this game offers some interesting universal tools for dealing with projectiles. You can hit projectiles back at your opponent, and you can even grab them and throw them. More or less, this gives the entire cast universal access to reflectors. Surely this hurts projectile users? Well, I think having reflectors is certainly better than not having reflectors when dealing with projectiles, but what was the whole point of throwing out a slow-moving projectile in the first place? It's to create positional advantage, which, as discussed earlier, one of the main points of that is to pressure your opponent into committing first. Using a reflector against a slow-moving projectile is such a commitment. Not only that, but it's one that requires you to time and space yourself a certain way, which makes you especially susceptible to being baited and punished. That means that if you are using your reflectors carelessly or predictably, you are playing right into the Zoners game plan of forcing you to commit first so that they can punish you for it. Reflectors are better than not in terms of dealing with projectiles, but I don't think they fundamentally shut down the Zoners game plan in any way. In terms of rushdown-oriented mechanics, we've seen both burst movement through air dashes, as well as burst approaches through dash attacks. Now, burst movement through air dashes we've already somewhat talked about, but basically, if you can approach with an air dash, you can also retreat with an air dash, not to mention that having fast downward air dashes can fortify safe vertical-based footsies. And dash attacks seem nice as a way to force engagements from across the screen. However, most of the dash attacks we've seen so far cover low to the ground, which means they're not going to pressure jumps that effectively, only landings, which, as we've already discussed, have a lot of mix-up potential in this game. Folks, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this speculation about the gameplay mechanics in Nickelodeon. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this, make sure you like and subscribe. Take it easy, everyone.